This film is concerned with how decadence's various connotations have informed theatre historically and in the present moment. How has decadence been staged? As an issue, as a practice, as a pejorative, as a site of pleasure? Where might we find it? Why might we look for it? And who is decadence for?
Your lovely charms will lead my arms, hold me in your spell, echoate my darling, so sweet and pretty. I can't forget those happy hours when in love we fell.
What you're about to see is linked to a project called Staging Decadence, which has been based largely out of London and New York, and the interviewees that you're going to be coming across are from those areas, which has shaped the sorts of insight that you're going to encounter. So we're not trying to cover everything here. This isn't a documentary about canonical writers of the fin de siècle like Oscar Wilde or J.K. Huysman. It's about how a few key performance makers and scholars have thought about decadence and why they keep coming back to its pleasures and complexity. So we're going to be journeying from ancient Roman actor emperors to ethereal plays of the 1890s in Europe, to countercultural bohemians in the 1960s, right through to performance makers of our own time. And along the way, you're going to see how decadence has been continually made and unmade. You're going to be coming across some competing, sometimes conflicting definitions. So let's start, as we mean to go on, with a potpourri of meanings and associations.
Decadence is something that you embrace or have a desire for that is beyond the conventional. So sometimes we think of decadence often in terms of food or luxuries, sort of decadent Christmas chocolates and that sort of thing. But I think it's probably more than that. It's something that has to also transgress particular boundaries and cross over from the realm of something that's socially acceptable to something that really does make you think about the limits of what you're doing and what you can do. And so for me, decadence is also a bit dangerous.
At first, what comes to my mind with the word decadence is the late 19th century, early 20th century libertine lifestyles and hedonistic aesthetics. It reminds me of interiors that are filled up with tapestry, that smell very heavily with smoke, sex, alcohol and perfumes. It's the homosexual behaviors, it's lesbians, it's femme fatales and emancipated women.
Decadence makes me think of, first Aubrey Beardsley. I think that was one of my first loves as a child. We had a book that was like a compendium of illustrators from the late 19th century, early 20th century, and I was very attracted to the Beardsleys.
I think of decadence as bringing together sensual pleasure, luxury, excess on the one hand, with immorality, guilt, suffering and death. And the way those are brought together, I think, is there's a kind of overarching historical pessimism, a sense that things just keep getting worse. So there's no reason not to do these things that are bad for us.
So I think the first place I go to is excess, right? Like too muchness, more than is needed. Great Gatsby, Beyonce's Instagram, Last Days of Rome, Venice, Festivale kind of stuff.
Some of the associations that you've just heard would be alien to scholars interested in how decadence was being imagined by artists and writers of the late 19th century, who tended to connect it to more archaic associations with decay. The fall of the Roman Empire has a lot to answer for here, which is why we're going to be turning to one of its more notorious leaders in a moment. But before we get to that, one of the things that often gets missed when decadence is connected to decay is that both refer to a process. It's what makes the live arts especially fitting in exploring what decadence is, but also what it can do. Another thing that gets missed, especially when decadence is connected to symbolism as an art and literary movement of the fin de siècle, is that decadence is nothing without the body, which more often than not resides at the very centre of performance.
Yeah, I think there is something very, very corporeal about decadence. They're very interested in physical pleasures, whereas I often sense with symbolists that their interest, particularly their interest in poetic language, it was a way of getting past the physical and material world altogether, whereas the decadents seem to be fascinated by the physical material world in all of its voluptuous excess.
Well, I think the thing with decadence is that you can't be passive when you engage with decadence. You're always engaged with it in quite a bodily way. So it does involve the senses of the reader or the viewer or the audience of a performance, for example. And there really is an obsession with the body in decadent work, and particularly what the body can do, so the limits of sensory experience or how senses can be intermingled through correspondence, through synesthesia.
There's something, I think, kind of public about decadence. There's an idea of it being spectacular, being a scandal, being an affront to a kind of idea of a civic norm, that it's not just rejecting, but being seen to reject.
For the Romans, though, when we go back and think of what we would now call decadence in the Roman period, although they talked about luxury and they talked about decline in terms of falling, it's a mix of both the expansion of empire, so when Rome was expanding from just Italy out to North Africa and then out to the Greek East as well, that of course came with a lot of money. There was a lot of finance that came back to Rome as a result, and there were also lots of riches and delicacies and spices and clothes and materials and colours that they weren't able to get hold of before, that they were now able to use. And as that comes back into Rome, of course, more traditional Roman moralists are going to start to get a bit concerned about this, because it's changing society, it's changing how political power is articulated through the kinds of dinners you can throw, through the sorts of clothes you wear. And they get very concerned that that then is having a moral effect, that the whole of society, because they see these great generals parading around in these ways, even people further down are then going to want to start to emulate that. And one historian in particular says, well, that then leads to crime, because then suddenly you get people who can't afford these luxuries wanting to do so and stealing in order to be able to afford this. Nero started pushing these boundaries in spades when he decided he wanted to be an actor. He was very interested in singing and performing and playing the kithera and chariot racing as well, so that is all part of the Roman idea of spectacle. Sport is also part of, in these big festivals you have sport and you have theatre alongside each other. So he wanted to participate in all of these things, and he was the first person to do so in public, the first emperor, the first big political figure, if you like, to do so in public. Not only does he act on the stage, he acts off the stage. So everything he does, according to some historians, is theatrical. He turns his family into actors. They have to know how to respond because he is always watching them. He is both an actor and he is the audience when he creates Rome as a sort of grand stage, with his family and with senators in particular kind of picked on for this. And he expects everyone all the time to understand their roles. That's how the historians describe it. So it's far more than just an emperor on stage. It is really getting to the core of tyranny. This is part of his tyranny. This is why it's such a big problem. It's not just he's an actor, it's that he uses acting as part of being a tyrant.
If I say that decadence is decline at its peak, it sort of sounds like I'm talking about some kind of culture that is simultaneously corrupt and refined. If I say that decadence is a critique of modernity, which I think it is, then I might be speaking more in philosophical or social terms.
When we talk about decadence, we must always talk about lineage, because all decadence is rooted, for me at least, and for people like me, in the French decadent movement. And what was that? That was a response to industrialization.
So I would say that although he would hate it, the grandfather of decadent literature is Charles Baudelaire, and he actually said that he didn't really want anything to do with the word. But when I'm asked that question, I think of, first of all, La Fleur de Mal, his collection of poetry from 1857, and the ideas of decadence, perversity, sexual deviancy, but also beauty, refinement, restriction, they can all be found in that collection of poetry.
Maurice Maeterlinck was a Belgian writer. He was a poet, first of all. He then wrote plays, and that's what really made him famous. So he, through the 1890s, he wrote a series of very, very important, influential plays that were very much aligned with the symbolist movement. He's very drawn, like a lot of the decadents, I think, to quasi-medieval settings where, or at least they're just medieval enough to not be placed very easily in any kind of real historical reality. And he wrote there's a play I'm thinking of called The Seven Princesses, which is about a knight, I think, who arrives at this castle to discover these 7 dying princesses. So even in that, you get the sense of decline and degeneration and decadence, and that love is always thwarted and always goes bad.
It's interesting to think of Maurice Maeterlinck, the symbolist playwright, as decadent, because symbolism is essentially very high-minded. It's a kind of non-religious spirituality is very much what it's involved in. So one wouldn't think of it as being concerned with the more degraded aspects of decadence. But you can make an argument, I think, for somebody like Maeterlinck, actually, that where he fits into the paradigm is that his kind of symbolism is individualistic, it's inwardly looking, it's turned itself away from affairs of state or even from social problems, actually. It's subjective experiment in a way, I think, symbolism. Now that would connect almost with the kind of Gibbon idea, actually, of what decadence is. Sort of religious overindulgence, possibly. So for all Maeterlinck's purity, as it were, you could see him as a decadent playwright.
The Martyrdom of Saint Sebastian was a production in 1911 in Paris at the Châtelet Theatre in Paris, and it involved a remarkable group of people. It was a collaboration between the Italian novelist and, to an extent, political figure Gabriele D'Annunzio, the French composer Claude Debussy, the Russian dancer Ida Rubinstein, and a designer Léon Bass. The production brought on the ire of the Catholic Church. They were troubled. The Paris Archbishop was troubled that a woman, and a Jewish woman at that, was playing a Christian male saint. They tried to bring down the production. It didn't work. The performance was widely attended, and it was a kind of dress rehearsal in some ways for the controversy that greeted Stravinsky's Rite of Spring a few years later. In this case, riots did not break out, but it was a performance that, in its androgynous primitivism, I think is in keeping with other experimental avant-garde performances at the beginning of the century.
Because D'Annunzio was he was a fascist. He really was a fascist. He was a minor dictator for a time. He was in league with Mussolini for a bit. There was a later falling out. He virtually had his own private army. So that raises questions, I think, in terms of politics and gender politics, certainly, but also the relationship of decadence to fascism. Is fascism an attempt to quell decadence? That's the way in which it would often present itself, I think. Or is it really decadence as a kind of sublimated continuation by other means?
With something like decadence and fascism, or decadence and conservatism, I think the problem that I have with thinking about those terms in relation is it's putting decadence into a kind of little category, into a little box again, and saying, decadence is fascist, or decadence is conservative, decadence is misogynistic. And actually, decadence is sometimes, and it sometimes isn't. Like, I don't think it can be affiliated so closely with one political movement, because it depends on who you're looking at when they're writing. It might even change from work to work or from place to place. So I think that's why I find it quite difficult to sort of make it fit neatly into those categories.
In the kind of political turn towards the right that we've seen in recent years, for me, I would locate decadence in the more left-leaning areas of life. So I think decadence has always been a champion of the outsider. Sometimes even decadent figures would be cultivating a deliberate pose of the outsider, an outsider status. If you think of the way Beardsley dressed himself, he didn't design himself to look like anybody else. He sort of models himself after a Notre Dame gargoyle, for example.
When I think of kind of decadent performance, first off, I really think of singular figures. Quentin Crisp comes to mind, who is perhaps marginally a performance maker, but more somebody who kind of inhabited a kind of theatrical lifestyle where the performance of self was really brought into, as a raconteur into forms of storytelling and living and life. Quentin Crisp, for me, then, as that figure, is decadent in not only in the way that Crisp dressed and performed his kind of excessive homosexuality, but also in the way that Crisp told anecdotes. For example, I think particularly around Crisp describing while dressed flamboyantly in his own apartment, talking about the fact that after 2 years of not cleaning, you don't need to clean anymore because the dust settles.
A performance maker who I immediately associate with decadence is Jack Smith. His commitment to making things out of trash, and not only like the physical trash of the objects that he would use, but the sort of like content of like recycled B-movie themes.
So Jack Smith was a legendary figure from the New York downtown art scene of the 50s, 60s, right through to the 80s. Smith was known for making film and performance that was decadent in the sense that he incorporated excessive kind of queer performers into his work with huge lavish sets, and his work operated always teetering on this edge of failure.
People like Jack Smith and John Vaccaro were looking 100 years back. They were looking at Melville, they were looking at Walt Whitman, they were looking further back to Baudelaire, they were looking to Rimbaud, they were looking always looking for their antecedents, for that lineage of what we come from, that gives us heart, that gives us backbone.
I think in the period I'm looking at, the 1880 to 1930 period, it's often the case that works of decadent literature deal with dissident kinds of sexuality. And that's not only, say, the case with the picture of Dorian Gray and its now famous homoeroticism, but it's the case for texts such as the French writer Richild's Monsieur Venus, strange erotic scenarios. In that novel, Monsieur Venus, an aristocratic woman trains her lover, her male lover, to be more like a woman. So queerness really is the perfect word for decadent literature, which isn't about a straight gay binary. It's about a spectrum of experimental erotic scenarios.
So one example that I've engaged with elements of decadence is to make myself not just visible, but hyper visible. And I have the example of the Sissy's Progress, which is a piece of work that came out of an experience I had of being attacked on the street. And I went through a process of trying to understand in my body and intellectually what led to that attack. What is it in me that attracts the negative attention of, in that case, young men? Why am I the target of violence? And I realized that that day I was dressed up in quite a flamboyant way, a decadent way. I had a feathered hat on with a veil. I had makeup on. I had high heel shoes on. And it was evening in the summer, so it was still daylight. I was coming back from the theater, and I turned a corner, and there they were. There was a gang of young men. And I realized that all that regalia, as it were, was what called their attention to me. Because the way that my body interacts with space, the way that I walk, the way that I am, makes me stand out from other people. And if I try to correct that, if I try not to stand out, I am performing a form of violence to my own body that society already performs. And I realize that not only is it impossible for me to erase who I am unwilling to do that. And that is my political stance. I am not only unable to do that, I am unwilling to do that. And I realized that for me, my agency and my power as an artist lies in turning up the volume. So in becoming more who I am, becoming more decadent, as it were.
And this is how you can be walking and falling at the same time.
I am looked at on a daily basis. I suffer verbal abuse on a daily basis. And that performance kind of framed in a safe way for the audience to see these things happening in front of their eyes. And it did happen. As soon as I went out onto the street, I would get comments, I would get looks, I would get pointed at, laughed at, and the audience could see that happening, and that was important for me, that piece brought that about.
de chagrin pour après. J'en ai tout un solfège sur cette terre qui bat comme un cœur de roi.
Another artist that comes to mind is Ron Athey. I think Ron Athey's work kind of in some ways really defines for me what maybe a decadent performance might be in its clashing of both the kind of intense viscerality of kind of ritualistic performances of bloodletting, for instance, clashed with the kind of artifice of theatrical costume and exuberant set. So I think there's something between the clashing of both artifice and then something really visceral, like a ritualistic bloodletting that really forms a kind of decadent experience or aesthetic in that work.
Ron Athey meant his performances to be a meditation on, but also a protest against intolerance and hostility around HIV positive men. And he really, I think, produced one of the more politically assertive renditions of Saint Sebastian worship, for lack of a better word. And it became a national controversy because a small amount of money from the federal government, I think it was $150, went to the gallery, the Walker Gallery that produced this performance. And Ron Athey was denounced in the U.S. Congress.
From North Carolina, Mr. Helms proposes an amendment number 2396 to the committee amendment on page 81.
This past March brought reports of an NEA subsidized performance by one of these artists, a man named Ron Athey. It's spelled Athey, but he insisted it be pronounced like A-T-H-E-E. Ron Athey, and I will try to remember to call him Ron Athey as I refer. That is his picture. A very handsome man, if you like that kind of man.
I think that the decadence does have elements of queerness inherently, especially if we consider queer from like in its original meaning as something that is weird and twisted, something that is against the norm or against the so-called nature. And I think that both decadence and queerness resist the assimilation into the mainstream. Deep Trash is an exhibition cum performance club night, as I call it. It was born in May 2013 out of a necessity to raise money for a festival against discriminations based on sex and gender identity in Italy. So its first name was Deep Trash Italia. We had so far 13 deep trashes. We have touched our capitalism, the occult, ecology, science fiction, religion, but also some specific geopolitical areas such as Greece, Italy, or the Spanish-speaking world. The performing decadent bodies do convey the queer feminist spirit of the event. And you can find performances that are extremely obscene. For example, we had Terrorismo Teatral Migrante from Spain, Berlin, and all parts of the world that came here, and they performed female ejaculation on stage, as well as an anal penetration with a European flag. Performances can be blasphemous. The artist Andy Jo, for example, she built a wooden cross in Italy, and a real size wooden cross. She folded it and transported it on her suitcase, unpacked it and built it here on this stage to perform flagellation and then crucifixion with a strap-on on.
Taste need to be cultivated. We're not born knowing what's bad for us. It's something we have to learn. You may remember that Gautier, in fact, in his 1868 essay on Baudelaire, described depravity as a quality that is not found in animals. It is only human. And there are different modalities of depravity that one can learn and cultivate.
I guess for me, what it means to cultivate a taste for decadence is to go for all the things that might be seen as offensive, as too much, as invasive, as taking too much space, as things that I'm not allowed to do. These are the things that I am going to do because I want to do them. I am challenging the rules, and I'm challenging who writes the rules.
As a concept, decadence is hardly without issue. In the late 19th and early 20th centuries, many writers and artists who are associated with decadence made frequent recourse to misogyny and Orientalism. But decadence, as has always been the case, is also ripe to be reclaimed and reimagined. Perhaps in doing so, we might learn something about why we value what we value, about privilege and its relationship to opulence, abundance and pleasure, or trash and scarcity.
In this country, Black folks have been denied every single luxury that exists, and the first generation of Black people that talks about gold or diamonds is like lambasted and denigrated, and I just think it's so backwards. The way that conversation goes, and so I'm really all about this notion that that is the thing, that like having material things is revolutionary. Actually, reparations is revolutionary. The redistribution of resources is exciting.
There was a Renier Lodge interview years and years ago where there was one line where she was kind of like, if you've never had money, I can understand you thinking it'd be the solution to all your problems. And like, I think about that a lot with like hip hop and decadence and excess, and like how it is played with in like the visual language of hip hop.
There's this line that I always say, I forget who sings this song. We should, whatever, if you use this clip, please cite the person who I'm quoting whose song I'm quoting. But he says, "Gold all in my chain, gold all in my watch. Don't believe me, just watch." And there's just, for me, that is the essence of a particular brand of hip hop. It's not all hip hop. There's also like a lot of anti-capitalist hip hop. And I don't necessarily think that hip hop that celebrates material things is capitalist, but that's a whole other conversation. But I think that there is here a reclamation of materiality, of excess, and of embodiment that really doesn't care about the white gaze in a way that makes me feel so excited and so joyful and so free.
Obviously, I do think the visual life
can reflect or does reflect the politics of the performance. So for me, thinking about ruination or failure or breakage, those are things which to me reflect how I feel or how I see the world. That's what it looks like. It doesn't look like a beautiful set with a door that opens and shuts really quietly. One of the first kind of projects that I was doing was doing biblical reenactments in nightclubs and cabarets. And that whole thing for me was about like taking a hugely epic story and like an epic search into these small, apparently very kind of casual spaces. And even if I get a gig at like some tiny club or something, I'll probably be like, tonight I'll be doing a 3-act play. Okay, sure, that might happen in 10 minutes and with stuff I've bought in the corner shop. But the attempt is to create decadence in the space and to create like scale and ambition.
I would describe a decadent object as something that it has so many layers of ornamentation and decoration and like incrustation of stuff that is not related to its function. And so, I think actually the first thing I think of when I think of a decadent object is like a gilt picture frame or something, like a really thick one. And just the thought that it's like the frame, is pulling focus from the picture itself. It's just about like this visual interest and incrustation on the frame. And in terms of how decadence figures into my design practice, I was thinking about, with my first theater company, the National Theater of the United States of America, one of my colleagues was just like noticing that it's like, I think she was just making a comparison between our work and some other work, and she was like, yeah, but our work always has like spats with fringes on them. So it's like there's always just this extra, like whenever there could be an extra thing, an extra trim or ribbon or notion on something, that you add it. Like you never, think about being, I guess, elegant or tasteful. You always want to add more. And to the point of like, the decadence of design doesn't necessarily have to do with the like meaning or function. It becomes its own sort of, driver of abstraction, I think. That you kind of like begin to spin out into like nonsense and abstraction by adding, more and more accretions of layers of trim and notions and stuff like that. This project, Psychic Self-Defense, which is the short pitch, is that it's a show made up of 45 minutes of curtains opening. I think something about that word decadence snapped into focus some aspect of my work that had sort of been building or maybe had always been there. And it was like some language that I was familiar with the term, but I hadn't really thought of like applying it to my own work, but it sort of fit in the way that like other words I had used before were like ornate or maximalist, and it felt like decadence sort of brings in another layer, which has to do, I think, with endings and with decay and like and with, I guess, the sort of like dark side of the maximal or something, and that seemed like being able to name that seemed really interesting to me and like exciting to have that vocabulary in the future.
Decadence really always ends up revolving around pleasure. And that certainly was true of the French decadent movement, because it was all about pleasure and sensuality and sexuality and oppositional to nature in a way. In my show Longing Lasts Longer, I say pleasure is a radical value.
I think that how we find pleasure is really, it's individual, it's cultural, it's national, And so, and I think that we can see lots of ways that decadence is misused, this notion of like overindulgence and greed, and particularly in regards to the racial capitalism that in my country we are living under. And I think that decadence in performance also, when reappropriated, has the opportunity and the possibility to really offer the kind of experience that is not available in the world, or that is less available in the world, in particular for folks who are marginalized.
I think decadence has always possibly come with a bit of a sense of pleasure at someone else's cost. How that's measured or expressed is very subjective, and I don't think is always there. But quite often there's a sense of decadence being something that's almost a zero-sum game, that for someone to indulge in decadence might be a problem for someone else.
I'm interested in decadence as permission, right? So like, if decadence allows you excess stuff, can it also allow you excess time? Can it also allow you like excess space? And like, what is it to claim excess if you're constantly being told to take up less space? What are the decadences that we like naturally get to live with and embody, and like, how do you claim those back from like capitalism that would take them and sell them back to you? It makes sense to me that like a lot of my work about fat most obviously engages with decadence of everything in my practice, because fat is an assumption of decadence, right? And also like an expectation that once you are fat, have fat, that like decadence and pleasure is something you should deny yourself. There was definitely lots of decadence in Patty and Prickett and Mock It Would Be, which is the first piece I made for Spill, which is maybe why Spill is what comes to mind when I think of decadence. So that performance was me and an audience building a dress out of cake onto my body for 8 hours. It's the kind of work where like now that I'm a bit more grown up, I'm like, that was a lot of food wastage. Was that okay? But I wasn't necessarily thinking with that kind of critical eye at that point. But that's a really decadent work. It costs loads to put on. It's so overwhelming, right? So you like walk into a space that like smells of cake, and by the end of it is like, there's like sugar in the air. You build the dress and then we decorate the dress, and I just stand there in it for 10 minutes, covered in like hundreds and thousands and cherries and icing, and it's really abject. I think it's beautiful and excessive, but it's also gross, because it's like cake that's being warmed with my body heat, and that loads of people have squished up so it will stick onto the wire frame, and then people are walking on it and it's in their feet. I think decadence always has a relationship with the abject and with grossness. I think they go hand in hand.
I think again it's like a core question in the work. Who is it for? Who is the decadence for? And one answer is, it is individualistic, it is for me, because I'm also using the audience for like, not exactly for my own gain, but for my own entertainment. There's also a genuine belief that it is about the group, like it just is. It is also sort of a community project.
In thinking back on the promiscuous histories that you've encountered in this film, journeying from Rome's first actor emperor to 19th century decadence, countercultural bohemians in the 1960s, right through to performance makers in our own day, it's clear that decadence is nothing if not a shapeshifter. It travels across time periods and continents and gets ever more saturated with meanings and associations along the way. But there's still a few key concerns that cut across the examples that we've been looking at, like why some bodies and desires are considered acceptable whilst others are demeaned, why some forms of creativity and diligence are considered worthwhile whilst others are marginalised, and why instrumentality so often seems to be a driver in the establishment of a worthwhile and the meaningful, which is especially important in contexts that undermine the arts as valueless.
The theatre is always in excess of what is needed. So it is eternally decadent. And then, of course, sometimes the theatre is about pointless, extraordinary pointless pleasures. You know, the fact that somebody sung that song so amazingly well is, you know, I mean, it's purely appealing to your sensual enjoyment of what other people's bodies can do. And that seems to me, that's an excitingly decadent thought. But I also think, and this is not a connection I think I would have made in the 1890s, but there's a kind of politics in that as well, that it's a glimpse of a world beyond the purely economic.
Decorate my darling, my island beauty, your lovely charms will lead my arms, hold me in your spell. Decorate my darling, so sweet and pretty, I can't forget those happy hours when in love we fell. I sang a song of love to you, 'neath tropic skies of magic blue. The lovely way you looked at me, your heart so true. Decorate my